Everyone. So I'm going to follow up that previous session if you were here for it, which was quite fabulous, I thought. We're going to follow up with a more consumer-focused discussion. If you don't know DCN and who we are, we're the only association that's exclusively focused on premium publishers, on content companies. So if you look at our brands up there, which I think they'll flash up there, we have about 75 members now. We've doubled in the past 2 years. But every one of our members is a premium publisher and has a direct relationship with consumers and advertisers. So that's what makes us unique. We're also not just focused on advertising revenue, we focus on the entire revenue stream. So discussions like this, we can kind of dive into the full mix and not just focus on the ad stream. So we've assembled here 3 speakers that we're delighted to have to really focus on the consumer. So I'll bring them up on stage. We've got Brendan Eich from Brave, one of the newest browsers out there, and Brendan is probably in the Silicon Valley Hall of Fame, if there is one. He invented JavaScript back in the day and was a co-founder of Mozilla, and now he's out there with one of the newest entrants in the ad blocking space. Chris Duncan, who's the Chief Customer Officer from News UK. Much experience on the advertising and marketing side. You can read his bio, but now he's in charge of customer for News UK. And then Dr. Johnny Ryan from PageFair, who has been, if you follow PageFair and their story, he's been one of the best voices out there in the ad blocking discussion. And he's also written quite a bit about the history of the internet, et cetera. So I'm going to slide over here and we'll get underway. I'm going to start off with just a first, thank you, by the way, gentlemen, for being here.
Thank you.
I should point out, too, we had one more panelist, Reagan McDonald from Mozilla Foundation, and she had a travel logistics issue, a visa issue, so she couldn't be here, and she sends her regards and apologizes profusely. We'll miss her, but I think the benefit here is we don't have an opening presentation. We can dive straight into a thoughtful discussion, and we got plenty of time for it. So, so a quick kind of binary question to start off with. If we can go down the line, do you see this ad blocking discussion, crisis, however you want to call it, as a problem, or do you see it as an opportunity?
Is this to me?
It's to you, Johnny.
I think it's a problem, it's a crisis that should not be wasted. You know, if you think about where all this comes from, where the ad blocking issue comes from, there's a whole history of, and I'm going to steal your words, of multi-billion-dollar investment in ad tech, with very few of those dollars being focused on the consumer or what the consumer wanted. So what we're seeing is this cul-de-sac that has been created by this weird circular dynamic where publishers are increasingly desperate to monetize the content they're giving away for free. And in a sense, they've let advertisers run amok on their websites. And in response, because they're getting increasingly snooped upon, because their connections are increasingly slowed, and because there's more and more ads shouting at each other, shouting over each other on the website, you're getting to a point where the consumer is taking action in their hundreds of millions and voting with their fingertips and saying no to ads. Now, I think we're going to look back maybe 5 years, maybe 3 years from now, and we're going to realize that this moment, this ad blocking crisis, which publishers really are feeling the pain from, that actually has been a very, very good thing, because it's like hitting the reset button. And if there's anything that publishers have needed for the last 10 years, and I used to be in that particular bucket, if there's anything that publishers have needed, that consumers need, and that I think advertisers need, it's a reset button. And ad blocking has done that.
Interesting. Brendan, problem or opportunity?
Well, both. They're duals of each other, like a promise and a threat. It seems to me the web took off too fast, and so the low-level affordances from the 90s, the cross-site image, the cookie, JavaScript, which I did in a mad hurry in 95 and 96, and something that came in the Internet Explorer, the iframe, those were enough to do advertising and let it evolve to a point where we need some kind of reset. But I worry that the reset will also be too fast and people will flock to a few walled gardens.
Makes sense. Chris, problem or opportunity?
I agree with both these gentlemen. I think it's a bit like teenage acne. It's ugly now, but it's really a product.
I've heard all of the metaphors, but I haven't heard that one.
That's brilliant.
It's a product of a big growth spurt somewhere else. And you've seen this huge change over the last few years, disruption by search, disruption into social. But what we've really seen the last 3 years is a concentration into the mobile. And that concentration into the smartphone has broken some of the previously working or creaking parts of the ad infrastructure. And in a sense, we've taken it out on customers. And so it's a huge opportunity, I think, to reflect and think, well, what does this new model, which none of us have seen before, how is that going to evolve over the next few years?
Yeah, yeah. So speaking of evolution, Brendan, you referenced the cookie. You were there when Lou Montoli, right, invented the cookie. You were there when Brendan Eich invented JavaScript.
I remember that.
So I imagine when those were invented, no one was thinking about the value for ad tech at all. So looking back, and that was 20 years, nearly 20 years ago. More?
Yeah.
So are we so built into that infrastructure that we can't evolve? Did you ever imagine that this is where we would end up?
No, and it wasn't planned, right? The cookie was mainly for caching your login credentials, so you didn't have to re-sign in all the time when you restarted your browser. It was a little bit of local storage for first-party information. But the image was already there from 1993 in Mosaic, thanks to Mark Andreessen, and it went cross-site, and the two of them combined made tracking. So if you think about intentional design of web standards, we can do a lot better. But right now, there's a big ecosystem that evolved. There's settled predator, prey, and parasite-host relations. And they're not totally stable, but all the incumbents are worried about a big change putting too many of their customers in trouble or putting themselves out of business.
Do you look back at those two things and think if they would have been done differently, things would be better?
Sure, I mean, you always look back. JavaScript has its own problems, which we fixed over time. So working in the standards process, especially with competitive balance in the browser market, which I helped restore with Firefox, has improved JavaScript in particular. But it's as a language, not as an affordance for advertising or something to do with user intent or payments or privacy. Those are higher levels of discourse that are not well served by the low-level web standards.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I?
Yeah, sure, jump in.
So even before the web, we have this amazing moment, right? We could have had something called X25. Yeah, right. So we could have had this totally locked down network that would work almost like when you're connecting to your Skybox. The telephone company controls everything. And instead of X25, which you don't know, you've never heard of, something else won, TCP/IP. And the Wild West was created. So all of the structures that we have are built on this magical mix of really disordered, really uncontrolled, very open and free protocols. And it creates this crazy situation. I see someone going, what's he talking about? What I'm saying is, everything that we do today is slightly built on shifting foundations. It could have been locked down in the 70s and 80s. And some of the things that we're seeing are slow evolutions out of that history. And so it shouldn't be too much of a shock that every now and again we get these big do-over moments.
You say that like it's a bad thing, but
No, I'm not. No.
I don't think that we would have had the internet and the web explode as they have if we had something like X25. I think it would not
totally
have
agree. Totally agree.
Yeah. No, I've heard both of you talk about that, and the importance of the open internet is something I think everybody that's been in this industry for a while appreciates. To that point, Johnny, most of the consumer, what's at least listed as a consumer-focused solution that I've seen so far. If you look at like the lean acronym was mentioned earlier by IAB, which is a nice framework for dealing with this problem. But then there was a follow-up called Deal, which was here's what publishers should consider doing. And I looked down that list, and it was circumventing the ad blocker, it was blocking the ad blocker, it was charging the consumer. And my one issue was that none of those tactics really seemed better for the consumer when I read through them. They were all things that would make things more difficult for the consumer or cost the consumer money. And then the other thing that's happening is this idea that Facebook, this closed platform and instant articles will be a solution, which that concerns me the greatest. I mean, it should anybody that we move to a closed platform. Is this a miss? Are we missing on the consumer here?
That's every question in one. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me try and tackle two of them. So Brendan already mentioned this hazard that if publishers feel that the open web is a hazardous platform for them, that they may start pumping their content, as some are already doing, into closed systems, into walled gardens like Facebook Instant Articles, like Apple News. And in that sense, they fall into the trap, the terrible trap that the music industry fell into so long ago, 15 years ago. And they become producers of commodity content. So clearly that is something that publishers should think long and hard about before engaging in. On Deal, To be honest, I haven't seen a very thorough breakdown of what deal is. So I don't feel equipped to critique it positively or negatively. I do hope that, I'm optimistic that what comes out of lean can be very useful and positive. Yeah. So let's see, and we want to support that as much as we can. I guess there's something in your question about how does this work for consumers, and I can't claim to be fully representing the consumer here by any stretch of the imagination, because the party that PageFair represents here is the publisher, right? That's who PageFair is fighting for. Now, the publisher will not be served by some short-termist solution that screws over the consumer, right? That can't happen. And the publisher won't be served by any short-term solution that shortchanges the advertiser either. So there's this moment that we've arrived at. At PageFair, you may recall we released a report back in August last year where we blew up a lot of the stuff around this topic. We've been looking at this for several years now because the founders of PageFair started off with this problem as publishers themselves, publishers of a very niche tech game website. And so they felt the pain of ad blocking. Now, what they have done over the last 6 years is develop a technology, and we haven't been talking about this very much, we're only starting to talk about it now, is develop a technology that can show ads in a way that ad blockers are entirely ineffective against. So this is something that we've been quiet about, we're teasing it out. The reason why we aren't going around the place marketing the hell out of this thing, I know I'm talking about it now in public, but the reason why we're not being loud about it is that we can't go and put back all of the ads without acknowledging that hundreds of millions of people have rebelled against the status quo in advertising. So we're trying to figure out what is a sustainable and responsible advertising experience the wrong word, ad that a consumer can tolerate. What is sustainable and responsible and will not bring us back into the same cul-de-sac? We have some ideas on that, and we're engaging with people around it.
Got it. Hey, so Brendan, I think you're trying to do maybe some of that with Brave. Can you give the audience the pitch on Brave?
Sure. So
accomplish?
What I'm trying to do with Brave is represent the consumer first, but also help the publishers, because we don't think simply blocking ads and giving users the best, fastest experience, cheapest data plan experience is good for the whole ecosystem. It's not ecologically sound. We want publishers to be more solvent than they are under the current regime. That means some combination of micropayments, we think, and better ads. And when I say better ads, I don't just mean lean. There was, in the last panel, a focus on surface characteristics. If they're more engaging, if they're lighter, if they use HTTPS, they'll be okay. What was ignored was the tracking that is required in many people's opinions to do that kind of advertising, and that takes a heavy cost in terms of scripts and pixels and signaling. And that's something that Brave blocks. So Brave is a very radical approach. We chlorinate the entire swimming pool because it's full of algae and critters and parasites. And we start over from a clean slate, but we try to give a default, because users don't change defaults at scale, that mixes better anonymous ads with private analytics for placing those ads, private to the browser, on device only, and ability to micropay your top 10 sites from a revenue share that we think the user is entitled to. So we're seeding a user wallet from ads we hope to insert. Now, everyone knows that there's some challenges to that whole plan, especially about inserting ads. But if we pull it off, we hope to make publishers direct payments of 55% of the advertising revenue and 15% to the user. And that's not a lot of money to the user, so by default, that trickles out to their top sites. So the total share to publishers is 70%. So Brave is actually trying to help publishers to the same revenue share level that Facebook Instant tries to reach, and the App Store, of course. And this is a generous revenue share, in my opinion. I've talked to a lot of publishers who see programmatic paying them less. They also like their direct and private marketplace sold ads where they think they're making more, but they're still paying partners. They're still paying for data and tracking. And we would like to help those publishers preserve their ads. Some of them are local, some of them are great native ads, but not use those trackers. We're against the trackers, and that's what Brave's about, and that's how we're growing.
Got it. So throw this to Chris. Chris, so if you look at kind of the three consumer issues that, if we try to summarize the issues that are causing ad blocking, I think Mozilla has done a good job of dividing those into security issues, privacy issues, and performance or experience issues. And everybody has a point of view, and there's different research on which one's the biggest issue. Do you see an underlying thread that kind of connects to all three that you're trying to focus on at News UK?
I think in some ways you have to look at those and preface it with saying that people don't like bad tracking, bad ads, and bad security. Customers are complex, and customers at the moment are saying, when you listen, that what they're basically saying is, I like unlimited content, I don't really want to pay directly for it. I like recognition when it suits me, but I don't really want it to do something that I don't like. I'm prepared to give details, and I'm prepared to give my thumbprint in some cases, but only in certain places. So for a publisher, for any consumer marketer, it's a very complicated set of rules to guide by. Consumers have expressed a very complex set of things that we have to do. So I don't think it's as simple as being able to just say, well, tracking is bad. Tracking is bad in certain cases, in certain places, by certain companies for certain ends, and consumers will absolutely, leap upon that and stop it. But that isn't always true. It's not as simple as that. So I think, as a publisher nowadays, there's a queue of people like Brendan and others who are queuing up to give publishers a rev share of things they used to keep all of, which is very generous of them all.
Not all.
They're not all of them, no. Some of the terms aren't that good. But from a publisher's point of view, I think you have to step back again and realize that what you can't do is get caught into managing the customer experience just on your own infrastructure. So a publisher today, will have come out and published the stories that we did this morning with Google, with Facebook, on our own infrastructure, on other apps, in Twitter's app, lots of different places. And what we have to be thinking about now is, how are we going to manage the customer experience of the future? How are we going to be able to provide an answer for customers who say, do you track me? And I have to say at the moment to that answer, well, where were you reading me? Because if you answer on your site, I track you in a certain way. If you were on Facebook, I track you in a different way. If you were on Twitter, but you were looking at a promoted ad for Amazon above my content, it's a totally different thing. And that's going to become a very, very important question, I think, for publishers and other brands to be able to answer that question. How do you track me in the everyday customer experience that I have with your content?
Yeah, the context of that. Johnny, did you have something to add?
Yeah, all of this gets much simpler once you're looking at, let's call it the blocked web. So you've got several 100 million people who are now blocking. And even if you went to a company, it could be PageFair, there'll be other people who can do the same thing soon, I would imagine, in the next 12, 18 months. So you go to some company and they help you show an ad to people who are blocking. You still don't get back the third-party tracking. That's gone. So on the blocked web, you're now dealing with, assuming you're looking at people who have blocked ads and are actually working with a blocker that cares about the user's privacy. On the blocked web, you're now working with an audience who are pretty much cookieless. So there was a lot in the last session about contextual targeting, which is exactly what you get on print, TV, cinema, everything, right? So you're back to a world of contextual targeting. And what have we known about data? What's been becoming clear about data over the last 4 years? Especially if there's a procurement person here from an advertising brand. That data should have been called Schmeda all along. Right? That there have been big question marks over some of those data. Now, I should have a graw. I should have, that's Irish slang for love. I should have some sort of sympathy for data people. I did a PhD, data mining, terrace forums and stuff. I don't buy it. And saying bye-bye to a system of advertising that relies on surveillance for one small portion of the web, is not a terrible price to pay. And from the consumer's perspective, they're no longer getting followed around the place. And I think that's very positive. And actually, the good news here for anyone who's working in an advertising agency is that, in a sense, you can have your cake and eat it. There is a slow disruption happening where the blocked web is gradually getting a bit bigger. Right? This isn't sky falling tomorrow stuff. So you can start to explore the old school contextual advertising, and yet you can continue on with business as usual if you think that's a good idea on the normal web.
I push back on one element of that, Johnny, and it's the further you get away with third parties, like the telephone game, the data becomes less valuable, right?
Yeah.
Because there's less transparency, and there's an extended relationship there. And so,
Unless it all gets harmonized somewhere, and they've now harmonized it with some data store that knows way more about you, like a loyalty card.
yeah.
So eventually it gets to a point where
Where it's more accurate and less comfortable.
and it's scary.
So it's really about the brand relationship and the consumer consent there.
Yeah.
Interesting. So the blocked web point. So we've very much, if you follow DCN, we very much focused on the consumer. We feel like all the noise in the marketplace and the strong language, the words extortion and mafia, et cetera, is a distraction from solving the consumer issue. And the ad blocking will continue to grow. So I guess a question for you is, AdBlock Plus, that was on the previous panel, has the largest market share. And I think people recognize that they allow through data collection and retargeting. Criteo was mentioned. Malware can still get through. If a browser like Brendan's, Brave, became the market share leader instead of Chrome, that does all these things, but it allows through trusted advertising from that publisher directly. Is that a better world 5 years from now?
So aside from who's doing it, the question is, if you had better and trusted advertising, would the world be better? The answer has to be yes. Maybe I'm simplifying this too much. Provided that world sees the ads of three characteristics. One is that if you're at a point where you can start to think, what ads should now be shown on this empty web, on the blocked web where people see almost no ads, what ads should now be shown? It's like you're now back to 1995, right? You're back at the beginning of advertising, and you get to decide, with the benefit of hindsight, what do we put back? Surely the first answer is, whatever we put back, we can't put back anywhere near as much as was on. There's all of these discussions about how do we make the creative better? What should the standards, really fixed bullet point standards of what's a good creative ad? There's all of these things. And what none of them acknowledge is creative quality of ads can't be good when there are too many ads, because the market incentive for the advertiser is to spray and pray. Whereas if you only permitted one or two ads in a short space over a certain amount of content, the advertiser would have to increase their investment in the quality of the creative. The second thing is, we're still running around the place serving active JavaScript in ads, which means that you're running a piece of alien code on someone else's computer. And we wonder why there's a security problem. Now, we had a security snafu of epic proportions internally a while back.
Halloween, right?
Aptly Halloween. And it gave us a shocking, we thought we had the realization, but we didn't have it until it bit us at home. So the idea of serving active JavaScript, I can't fathom how we still do that, because it exposes people to security risks.
Chris, you're leaning in.
I just wanted to pick up on one point earlier, which is you said if Brendan's browser became the market leader. I mean, I think let's not be naive. The market-leading browsers are owned by ad networks, and so you
One of them.
Yeah, but there is a point that they are owned effectively.
Well, I would argue Facebook in some ways is a market-leading browser too, and it's essentially an ad tech company.
And some of which, in some ways, will be affected by ad blocking. So there is a slightly asymmetric advantage here to people who have done a brilliant job of creating a customer experience on mobile that does not look like traditional display advertising. And I think the point about going, a lot of people, when they have this debate, you go back to 1995 standards for ads. So you're still thinking of it's still a skyscraper. It's still, this is a beautiful piece of display creative which will grasp customers by their hearts because it's got pictures in it.
Yeah.
Those days are over. So I think when you think about advertising as a broad discipline, you're talking about your position in search. You're talking about your associations in social. You're talking about lots of things that aren't traditional and therefore blockable display ads.
So I like what Joe Marchese of Truex says. You want, as an advertiser, you're really doing marketing. You want the right ad at the right time for the right person. And that goes against shotgunning the space, right? Trying to get share of voice by guessing all the sites you might go to or just buying a lot of space there. And if you have fewer ads and you make them really beautiful, you still might miss the target. And it would be wasted effort. So there's something on smartphones that we have to pay attention to. Display doesn't work. And with Brave, we're looking at this and thinking maybe there's a better model. Maybe it's more like Google Now, except Google Now is a tiny card ecosystem managed by engineers in Mountain View, but something that uses local AI mostly and data sources to figure out for you what that right moment is for that promotion. That seems important to me for advertisers as well as publishers. And that's a different model from what we're used to. It's not 1995 again.
Well, two things. Brendan's referencing Joe Marchese, who runs advertising now for Fox, 21st Century Fox, and he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, I'd like to go door to door to tell everyone to install an ad blocker, which was quite interesting perspective that you should read, coming from somebody who runs advertising for 21st Century Fox. The fact that his boss even let him write that is amazing. You're also referencing, Brendan, the nature of direct response, performance-based advertising, which is a majority of digital, where you need that targeting. There are still questions around brand advertising, whether or not you need that level of targeting. One thing I do feel like I at least want to ask one question about. Actually, I'm going to allow Brendan and Chris to ask each other a question, so I'll let you think about the question. But the Newspaper Association of America, just so you know, sent a letter over to Brendan's group 2 weeks ago, an unpleasant letter about the nature of blocking and replacing. And so it's interesting to me that, Chris and Brendan, as I've talked to them, are 100% focused on the consumer. So I think they probably agree a lot more than they disagree. So I want to allow them to each ask each other a question while you're thinking about it, since you didn't know I was going to do that to you. I'm going to flip it to Johnny with a separate question, a filler here. You referenced earlier the music industry. Yeah. And one of the questions, I look back at the music industry and what happened with piracy. Everyone was focused on free versus pay, and people were ripping off music. And it turned out that the real solution was, and what the consumer really wanted was, they wanted individual songs. They wanted portability. They wanted a better user experience. Is there a lesson there for us in terms of how we address this?
Well, the first lesson is suing Napster didn't solve the problem.
Yeah.
Right. So suing IO, the company behind AdBlock Plus,
5 times they've.
There is something very empowering about taking action when you're under pressure.
Yeah.
So the incentive to take action and that be conspicuous, I emotionally I would understand that. But the example from the music industry is, if you knock out one player, there's no reason why other players cannot join the fray.
Yeah.
and that's certainly the case. The other example, the other lesson is, though, it's very hard to predict what is in the consumer's mind, right? So the music industry could have come up with all sorts of different models for what might have worked. They just did not have the structures to explore what those models might be. In the advertising industry, we've had about 130 years of experience that essentially boil down to this. If the punter can avoid the ad, the punter will avoid the ad, right? There was a reference to the remote control in the last panel as though it were invented in the 80s. It was invented in 1952. But people have always been able to swivel their necks.
Yeah.
So people skip the ads. That's not going to change. We know that outdoor advertising has always worked. And there's this idea, I don't know where 50% of my budget's going and so on. There's this idea that actually outdoor advertising has an enduring quality. Even if everyone's walking around the place wearing VR headsets in 10 years, we're still going to do outdoor ads. I'm not necessarily here to defend the display ad format. I've no investment in that particular part of the status quo. But I'd say we're still going to be seeing display ads, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. Pixels on screen.
Yeah, and that intensive targeting, right down to the individual, is not necessarily better than a outdoor big billboard. And what's going on here? What's going on here is that the web has always been this race to cheapness, right? It's been race to cheapness for performance, and it has never really successfully been, are we going to pay for value to build brands? It's never been good at above the funnel. And now you have this bunch of people who are pissed off with the status quo, who've been at the bottom of the funnel. Now they've switched off tracking. You can show them respectful ads. And in doing so, I think you're getting to the point where you have a part of the web you can have above the funnel advertising to.
All right, question. You want to go first, Chris?
I'll go first, yeah. Sure. It's a nice surprise, Jason, thank you. I guess my question would be, Feels to me like in the last couple of years, the sort of open web is being carved up slightly, and there is a sort of an oligarchy sort of taking shape. These problems to me feel like a little bit like there is a higher order problem of digital identity, digital payments, how I represent myself when I have literally one phone, but many, many relationships with it. I guess I'm really interested in just a vision of where you see that coming.
Right. Well, that's the higher domain of discourse that the standards never got to because of this system that evolved rapidly, but it tended to pull people into a particular payment provider or a particular social network, a particular website that they would sign into. And that hasn't been good for consumers because you only are going to sign into a handful before you get tired of it. And if you did it with Friendster, you went to MySpace and then Facebook and you've stuck there, but your children aren't there anymore. They've gone somewhere else. So there's a gap in the web standards around identity, and identity is not at all simple. In the UK, there's this identity project, I understand, that's coming along, and it's federated, and you have to go to the identity provider to get fresh credentials whenever you sign on. Experian is one of those providers. They've had some security problems lately, so I'm not too sure about them. I think this is not going to be solved top down. This has to be something that gets built bottom up. And at Mozilla, when I was there, we tried something federated, but it felt weird to people to have this third party, the identity provider, sort of fly a pop-up asking you to sort of sign in there before you could use the site. So my hope is that before we get to anything like a global multi-persona identity system, because you need multiple facets to present, we need publishers and I would say software makers, browser or web view or app makers to innovate. And that's what I'm trying to do with Brave. Brave is not trying to corner the browser market. We're not trying to own the user data on the device only where the user has access to it and we are blind to it. That's how we're starting. The users should get paid along the way. They should have strong privacy and anonymity guarantees. But what we want to do is compete and inform standards, which means we don't need to take over the market. We just need enough share to drive anonymous, zero-knowledge, proof-based advertising or other things we're doing.
All right, you got a question?
Sure. So you said when you run the ads on your own infrastructure, you get 100% of the revenue, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. And you're paying for the infrastructure, you're paying for your partners who do tracking. When I look inside these direct sold, sometimes native ads, whatever they are, I see tons of Blue Kai and other pixels and cookies. They're not working for free. So how much are you actually paying them, can you say?
I definitely can't say. I definitely can't say, partly because it's not, to be fair, it's not just me being evasive, it's not actually my side of the business. I'm sure we do on the way pay for a lot of what we do. It's a very incredibly complicated, the middleware that sits in the middle of the digital ad ecosystem is you see every year the diagram gets bigger.
Yes,
and
the Lumascape.
Yeah, the number of places that you can find your sort of your audience or your share of revenue dissipating is huge. I think the question for publishers, which probably more what I was alluding to, is a sense of control of networks. And that's the big challenge for us over the next few years is, I think as publishers as a group have never been very good at considering their sort of best interests as a collective. We're very good, I think, at considering how we could fight each other. That takes up more of our attention. But I think over the next few years, the economics have shifted in how publishers are going to have to make revenues. We're going to have a different conversation with consumers to make sure that they understand the value of the investments that we make, the value of our sort of presence, the kind of things that they would miss if we cease to be able to fund a very wide range of publishers. And so to some extent, control, I think, of understanding, let's make sure that we can pay journalists, I guess, is the existential question for publishers.
I share that concern too.
A general data point to answer Brandon's question, 55% of programmatic dollars go to intermediaries, according to the IAB's data, which at least the IAB in the US is a lot of those ad tech companies are its members. So I consider that a pretty good data point. Now that's interesting, that's the programmatic piece, which is for publishers is typically like between $1.50, $2 CPMs. They get 10 times that for their direct inventory. And so we also need to recognize that that type of advertising, the bottom of the funnel programmatic advertising, doesn't pay for high quality journalism and entertainment. And so that's the disconnect that we need to work on. Do we have time for a question from the audience or no? I'm getting the, okay. One question? Okay, great.
Quick question. Is it on? Yeah. Question for Brendan. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that out of all the people in this room, probably you and I are the only ones who've read every single RFC on cookies and the discussion which took place in the 90s over the years. And initially there was a huge push against third-party cookies. And over the years, that argument got worn down. We saw exactly the same thing replicated with the W3C do not track process over a 3-year period. It was completely destroyed. It's clear, in my experience, that we can't trust the industry to fix things themselves. We need disruptive technologies and disruptive behavior from users to force that change. How do you predict the next 10 years moving forward in this ecosystem?
Oh, well, first of all,
1 minute.
I agree with your premise, but I think it's very hard to predict. It's a very chaotic time. We've come from what was looking like a stable regime with, I'd say, larger screen advertising, and now, since 2007 and the iPhone, everything's in flux again. And it will not look the same in the future. It will perhaps rhyme, history rhymes, doesn't repeat, but, and display will be there. There'll be some display ads, but I think what has to happen is consumer movement to rebel against some of the things that are abusive. Like malvertisement, ransomware gets into the ad system, and the publisher who thinks that they're entitled to all the good upside of their ads suddenly doesn't want the liability that might attach to that. So I think liability and consumer activism might force the issue. Ad blocking is just the beginning, right? If malvertisement keeps being a problem, ad blocker adoption is going to go up, and you're going to see case law. You're going to see class action suits.
Well, I want to say thank you. I find this a very thoughtful and collaborative discussion, hopefully an honest discussion regarding the problem. So give a round of applause for the panelists, please.
Sorry, on a legal note.
Ladies and gentlemen, please make your way out of the theatre through the